Hello, everyone, and welcome to another SCJ Marketing Think Tank webinar. Today, we'll be talking about how to use a podcast to build your email list. And we'll be talking actually with Jerod Morris, who is the VP of Marketing at Rainmaker Digital. I'm going to let you give a quick introduction of yourself, Jerod, and then I'll jump into some housekeeping when you're done.
Sure, yeah, like you said, I'm the VP of Marketing for Rainmaker Digital. I've been working for Rainmaker Digital / Copyblogger. That's, if you don't know what Rainmaker Digital is, we used to be Copyblogger Media. I've been working there since 2013, and I've been running podcasts since before that. I actually just signed up for the new Podcast Connect on Apple, and it shows you all the different podcasts that you have submitted to iTunes. And I thought that it was 10, but it's actually 12. So I've actually launched 12 different shows before. I'm currently running 5. So I run a lot of shows for work, and then in my free time when I don't have to be working, I still run podcasts because I love doing it. And so
Wow.
hoping that I can share some of that experience with everybody here today.
Well, that's awesome. I have to admit I have a hard time keeping up with this, just the one that we have. So I could imagine keeping up with 5. So let me jump through a little bit of housekeeping. If during the webinar at any point anyone has any questions, comments, anything that you feel is appropriate for a public setting, you're absolutely welcome to throw it into the webinar question box, which is down at the bottom. We also monitor Twitter. We use the hashtag SEJ Think Tank. That's one word, SEJ Think Tank, and you can ask your questions, make your comments there as well. We're going to have a couple polls throughout the presentation. That's your opportunity to participate, and it gives us a little bit of feedback to kind of know, how to answer questions or how to continue giving you the information that you need. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so we advise everybody to stick around, participate with that. Throughout the presentation, we're going to do our best to link any resources. If Jerod mentions a tool, we're going to try to link it. If we fail or if we miss something, then by all means just ask us in the question box or through Twitter, and we'll make sure that we get that resource. I do want to ask everybody if you can spend a couple minutes after the webinar. We have a small survey that will go out. Doesn't take a lot of time, and it really helps us to kind of adjust how we do the show to make sure we're, meeting everybody's needs. Lastly, we're going to take everything, all the stuff we talked about, all the Q&A, all the questions, all the resources, and we're going to put it all into a recap post along with a video of this entire webinar, and that will go up on Search Engine Journal within the next couple days as well. So you can share it, participate, rewatch, whatever you need to do. So without any further ado, Jerod, let's jump into talking about using a podcast to build your email list.
Sure, let's do it. And I do want to start just by thanking you, Brent, and everybody at SEJ for giving me this chance, because project that I love talking about. It's had a big impact on me both personally and professionally, and so I'm excited to be able to share some of this with your audience. I think it'll be fun. A little bit more about me. Like I said, I'm the VP of Marketing for Rainmaker Digital, and I host a podcast called The Showrunner. So for anybody who is watching this and who wants more insights on how to develop, launch, and run a successful podcast, The Showrunner is the place to get that. In addition to that, I am a writer, a teacher, a husband, a Hoosier, as you'll find out from one of my other shows, as well as a digital entrepreneur, which is another new show that I'm running, because as I said, I host 5 different podcasts. And if you want just kind of something little interesting and quirky about me, I make remarkable guacamole and homemade tomato sauce. So with that said, let's jump in. And Brent, if you don't mind, I would actually like to start with a poll right off the bat, because it would be interesting to know kind of where the audience is when it comes to podcasting and having an email list. And so
Awesome.
if we can start here, this would give me some good insight.
Awesome, perfect. So I'm going to pop up the first poll, and I'll go ahead and read kind of what it is. It's the question is, are you hosting a podcast and building an email list right now? You have 4 options. Yes, I am doing both. Yes, I'm doing a podcast, but no email list right now. Yes, I'm doing an email list, but no podcast. Or no, I'm sadly doing neither, which is why I'm here. So again, we'll give everybody a couple minutes. If we can, I'll ask everybody, please, throw a vote out there real quick. Just take a couple seconds. We'll give everybody, about another 5 seconds to kind of throw in a vote, and then I'll show the results.
Perfect. And there are no wrong answers. I hope by the end of the presentation that you will want to be doing both, but if you're not yet, no problem at all.
All right, here we go. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So actually, a lot with the email list and not as much with the podcast. So I think that's a good indicator that people are going to be learning quite a bit. Um,
Very interesting. Okay, excellent, excellent. That's very good insight. So yeah, perfect. So let's hop into this now. And let's start with two key questions, okay, to make sure that we know why we're here. And the first one is why start a podcast? And actually from the results of that poll, it seems like the majority of people here will probably need to hear this because I think it was 50% have an email list but haven't started a podcast yet. So here's why you would want to start a podcast. So let's run through some numbers. First, 33% of people have listened to a podcast at least once. And that number has tripled since 2006. And all these stats about podcasts are courtesy of the Podcast Consumer Report from 2015 by Edison Research and Triton Digital. They do this every year, and this is the most recent one. And if you look at that number and you see the 33% and you say, well, that's not that much, remember that it's 106.3 million people just in the United States. That's a big number. But on the flip side, it also shows you how big how much room the market has to grow, because there's still 67% of people who haven't yet listened to a podcast who will be in the future. So there's one number. Next is 17% of people have listened to a podcast in the last month. So it's not just that people have listened to it, that they're familiar with what podcasts are. People are listening regularly. And again, that number is growing. And that number is 54.2 million people just in the last month have listened to a podcast. The gender split is exactly 50-50, so it's not like, one gender is listening more than others. And this is the biggest one right here, especially when we're talking about why you would want to launch a podcast in conjunction with your business to help you build a business, which is that podcast consumers are more affluent. 36% make $75,000 a year or more. They're more educated, 85% attended college, and they're highly engaged, where the average listener is actually listening to 6 episodes per week. All right? So awareness keeps growing, the market is attractive and has a lot of room to continue growing, and the impact is obvious. So in other words, now is still a perfect time to launch a podcast. All right, let's go on to the second question now, which is why build an email list? Well, there's been a lot of talk about how social media is going to overtake email, and maybe email is not as great as it once was, but that's just not true, and the numbers don't back it up. The ROI on email is 4,300%. That's a crazy number. Email is 40 times better than Facebook or Twitter for acquiring customers. So certainly if you are looking at a podcast for building a business, attaching an email list to it is essential. Not that you don't want to be out on social media, but having an email list will help make you 40 times better for actually acquiring customers. A nurtured lead increases sales 20% more than a cold lead. And 95% of those who opt into email messages from brands find these messages somewhat or very useful. So don't think that people are just going to opt in and not care. When people do opt into your messages, they care. They want to know what you have to say. They're interested in engaging with that content. So in other words, now is still a perfect time to build an email list. So it's a perfect time to start a podcast. It's a perfect time to start an email list. It's okay if you didn't start one 10 years ago. We all wish that we had, but that's okay. The next best time to do it is today. All right, so now that we've established that we've established why it's a great time to start a podcast, that we've established why it's a great time to attach an email list to that podcast and to engage with your audience in that way, let's talk about how to link these together, how to use a podcast to build your email list. And we're going to break this down into a simple 4-step plan. And the first step is very simple. You've got to develop, launch, and run a remarkable show. That is the first step, is if you're going to engage an audience and build an email list from your podcast, then you've got to have a really good podcast. It's the same thing if you want to build an email list off of your blog. You need to have a good blog that engages folks. Same thing with a podcast. And what makes a podcast so powerful is its ability to engage an audience, right? Because when you think about when people listen to a podcast, they're listening a lot of times in places where they don't allow other people, right? They're listening in the shower, when they're getting ready for work, when they're working out, when they're walking their dog. These kind of intimate moments, and they're letting you, your voice, inside of their head. That helps you develop a connection, okay? Now, I do want to let you know that we're going to talk now about these 4 essential elements of a remarkable podcast. And if you go to rainmaker.fm/4elements, you can download an ebook that goes into these in more detail, because I don't have enough time today to go fully in depth on all of these. But if you want more, go get that ebook. It's free. In fact, when you go to that link, it'll just download right to your computer. You can have that. You can read it. It will give you a little bit more insight into what I'm about to talk about right now. But again, it's so important. You can't just expect to be able to slap an opt-in page up on a site and just start grabbing email subscribers who are really engaged with you. It's got to start with the content. They've got to build that know, like, and trust from your content before they'll get on the email list and engage with you. All right? So the first essential element is that a remarkable show is authentic. And when I talk about authenticity, I'm not talking about transparency. This isn't about revealing everything about yourself, right? It's being strategic about finding the intersection between you and your knowledge and your experience and what you're passionate about, and then where that intersects with an audience's goals and interests and dreams and where they want to go. Right? Because ultimately we're trying to help an audience make a transformation. That's what is going to keep them connected with us. And if we have products to sell, if we're building a business, that's going to encourage them or make them want whatever we have. And the first step to that is developing an authentic connection. So knowing yourself, knowing your audience, and finding the intersection between the two. I'll use as an example one of my shows called The Assembly Call, which I think has succeeded and now has an email list of almost 1,700 people that are highly engaged, that support our show through their donations. And a big reason why that show is successful is because I know myself. You can see my hat right here, my IU hat. I grew up loving Indiana basketball, right? I know the subject. I have insight that I can give. And especially I knew that after games, there was a need for this because there wasn't any type of post-game show. So I knew myself, and we started that show, and it's connected with an audience because we know that for Hoosier fans scattered all across the country, they desire connection, and they desire a place to extend the conversation after the games are over. And our show finds that intersection, which is why it connects. And then because of what I'm going to tell you a little bit later about how to have a compelling offer and a compelling incentive, we've built an email list because of it. But it's the authentic connection we have with that show that makes that possible. The second element of a remarkable podcast is being useful. And what this boils down to is an understanding that when an audience comes to our show, they are investing something valuable in our show. They're investing their time. And they need to get a return on that investment, which means they need to be educated, they need to be entertained, or they need to be inspired. And we need to understand what they're coming to us for more than anything else. So for example, everyone who is on this webinar right now is here because they want to be educated about how to use a podcast to build their email list, right? That's the #1 element of usefulness. Now, to the extent that I can entertain you and maybe inspire you along the way, that's great, and I want to do that, but the primary element of usefulness has to be there. That's our big idea with the Showrunner, our podcast about podcasting, right? Which is we know people are coming for the education, but we hope that the banter that Johnny and I have, that it's entertaining. We hope that our stories and our pep talks are inspiring, but you got to understand what people are coming to you for over anything else. That usefulness is so important. And if you are useful for people and they get value from you, they're going to want to engage more, which will then encourage them to get on your email list. And what's interesting is there's actually another element of usefulness that when we originally came up with these 4 essential elements, we didn't really think about, but an interview that John Nastor did, his show, of course, is Hack the Entrepreneur, an interview that he did with Alex Bloomberg of Startup made us rethink this, because to Alex Bloomberg, who clearly is a pioneer of this medium, companionship is one of the most important elements of a podcast. And I love that, and I agree with it. And it goes back to what I talked about before, where people let you in when they're listening to a podcast. You know, they're letting you into these intimate moments, and they want companionship. And you can really provide that with a podcast, which is why it is such a great precursor for an email list, because it's not just words on a page on a blog post that gets you to opt in. It's actually hearing someone and getting to know them and really getting to like them. And that companionship will really help prime, I think, people getting onto your email list and being more ready, more primed to actually take action on whatever it is that's going to be in your email list. So that's usefulness. So we've got authenticity, usefulness, and if we could stop again, Brent, and do another poll question, I'd love to know what folks think is actually the most important objective of a podcast out of those four that we just discussed.
Perfect. So popping up the poll right now. Again, what do you think is the most important objective for a podcast? 1, to educate, 2, to entertain, 3, to inspire, or 4, to offer companionship? Again, what do you think is the most important objective for a podcast? If you had to choose one, it would be, we'll give it a couple more seconds. We got about 70% of the vote in. So once I hit over 70, we'll go ahead and close it out. All right, there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and then show you the results. Educate.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's what I would have guessed.
And frankly, for me too, you know, especially when we first started this, I do think, you know, especially for those of us who are in content marketing, then we really do want to educate because that's why people are coming. And again, I think what's most important above all else is that we know what our audience is expecting, because it's not as important what we think the most important part of our show is. What's more important is what they're expecting, and make sure that what we're providing fits with their expectations. Okay, so let's run through now the third and fourth essential elements of a remarkable podcast. Sustainability is the third one. And this one, frankly, is the easiest one to explain and the hardest one to do, because to have a sustainable show, you've got to show up, right? You've got to show up for the first time and put something out there. You've got to show up reliably so that people know when you're going to be there and where you're going to be. And then you've got to show up reliably over time so people have a chance to get to know you, get to know your content, be impacted by it, and build that trust. And the Assembly Call, my show about IU basketball, has succeeded because we show up immediately after every game, and people know that when the game ends, we're going to be there. And that has been huge. And doing that over 5 years has developed that connection. As another example, you know, I have a show that I do, Profitability Primer, which I started out doing every day and then switched to doing bi-weekly. And you know, that show has succeeded to a certain extent, and it's grown to a certain extent, but it hasn't grown as much as it could have because I've done the first part. I've shown up, but I haven't shown up reliably and haven't shown up reliably over time yet. It's only 6 months old to really build that big connection. But sustainability is such an important part of this because, again, we want people to know us, like us, and trust us. Well, they can know us and they can like us from the first show, but people are only really going to trust us when we've shown up over time and consistently delivered value. So don't underestimate this. And again, it's easy to say, but it can be a little bit difficult to do with a podcast, to show up every week or every other week or whatever your schedule is, but don't underestimate the compounding impact that can have. And then finally, profitability, because ultimately for your podcast to last and for the email list that you build off of your podcast to last, you have to keep that show going. And to keep that show going, that means there must be an element of profitability. Otherwise, you're going to have to stop doing it. And that can be direct profit, meaning that you make money directly off the show. Maybe you sell ads, or maybe you sell access to your archives. It can be indirect profitability, which is probably the one that most of us here would think about, and that's more using a podcast for content marketing, like we do, you know, with the Rainmaker platform, with Rainmaker FM, where we're not selling ads on that. We're directing people to the forum, and that's a way to benefit indirectly. I do that actually with another Indiana show that I host, Podcast on the Brink, where I don't get paid for hosting the show. It's for someone else's site. But to me, there's an indirect profitability because that lets people know about the Assembly Call and gets us listeners over there. So, and then there's just the intrinsic profitability of really enjoying what you're doing. Because if you don't really enjoy what you're doing, if you don't get more out of the time you invest than what that time costs you to put in, you're not going to continue doing it. And so don't forget about this profitability part. Don't think that it's somehow bad to profit off of a podcast. you need to, either directly, indirectly, or certainly intrinsically, or it will never last, and you'll never truly give yourself and your audience something remarkable over time that will build value. All right, so that was step one. And step one, if you're going to build an email list off of a podcast, you've got to develop a great podcast. That's the first step, okay? So be authentic, be useful, be sustainable, and be profitable. Now you've got a podcast that is ready to build an email list. So how do you do that? Well, you've got to craft a compelling incentive and a compelling offer. And so in step two, let's talk about what that means. Okay, so what is a compelling incentive? All right, a compelling incentive means what's going to get the person onto the email list, right? What is their incentive to join your email list? We all struggle with spam. We all struggle with our inboxes just being overloaded. So we've really got to incent people to give us their email address because while we can say that's quote-unquote free, we know as audience members that it's not really free. If I'm giving you my email address, you're going to be bringing something into my inbox. It's going to take me time to kind of process that and figure out if I want to read it, if I want to archive it, whatever. So there is a cost involved there, and we've got to give an incentive that's good enough to overcome that. So it's got to be something so good that they can't say no. Okay, they've got to give you their email address because it's just so good. And it's got to be something that they can't get anywhere else, because if they can get it anywhere else, especially if they can get it without giving you an email address, they probably will. All right? And here's a very important point. Don't be afraid to give away your best stuff, right? There's Eugene Schwartz, an old copywriter, used to talk about that to sell a book, the best way to sell a book is to actually give away the best part of the book and give people that value, and they'll still want the book. He sold tons and tons of books that way. And that's always been our philosophy at Copyblogger and Rainmaker Digital, which is give until you feel like you're giving away too much, and then give away a little bit more. And you can do that, and it's not going to impact your eventual profitability when you have something to sell, because you can explain the why and you can give people the big picture, but everybody's going to need help on the how and on the specifics and the implementation. And there's always room to charge for that or to do something extra there. But don't be afraid to give away your best general information, because that's what will attract people and say, I've got to connect more with these folks. So remember that with your incentive. You know, whatever you think is too much, err on the side of going actually more than that, than pulling back. It will help you build your email list, which will help you build a better connection, which will help you either just build a better audience, or if you have bigger goals like building a business, will help you achieve that as well. Okay, so as an example of this, we just created this beginner's guide to launching a remarkable podcast. And essentially, we took a lot of the best stuff from our course. We have a course called the Showrunner Podcasting Course, and you can get information about that at showrunnercourse.com if you're interested. But we basically took some of the best stuff and put it into a free report. And we're going to use that free report as an incentive, as a lead magnet to get people onto our email list. And it's funny, ironically, we're actually in the process of changing up our funnels for the Showrunner. So if you go to rainmaker.fm/showrunner-report right now, you can actually click the button and get this free report without getting on the email list, which is, I guess, ironic considering what my topic is for this presentation. But we had it as the lead magnet for the email list before, but because of some things we're doing with Facebook, now we're giving it away without people even getting on the email list, because it will help us connect and help us grow the course in the future. But this is an example of that, because this is a really good guide. Like if we decided to put this up on Amazon for $10, I would not feel bad about taking $10 from people for this book, because it's really valuable. But it will offer much more value to us in the long run, getting people on our list to stay connected with our show, to stay connected with the course, by allowing people to have it for free and just to find out what we're about, to see our philosophy, and to benefit from our information. So examples of compelling incentives: a free report, like I just said, timely email-only content. An example of that would be the assembly call. We have built our entire email list of almost 1,700 people by putting out post-game emails the day after games that we don't publish on our blog. They're 1,000-word emails. They're really detailed. It's only for our subscribers. They have to subscribe to get it. A free course is another example. Belinda Weaver of Copyright Matters does a really good job with this, of having a free email course that you sign up for her email list and you get it. That's a very compelling incentive. You could even give people access to a community, whether it's a forum or something else like that, that just by getting on the email list they can get into. And you can set that up on Facebook, and maybe you only send out the URL to someone who subscribes. Plenty of different ways to set that up. But again, it's got to be compelling and so good they can't say no, and something they can't get anywhere else. So that's the incentive, but then you've got to make the offer. Okay, so you've got to tell people about the incentive and let them know what they need to do to take advantage of it. So what is a compelling offer? Well, the first element of a compelling offer is it's got to be urgent. Why should I act right now? Because if the moment passes, people probably aren't going to act. So you want to make it urgent for why they've got to act right now. And then there's got to be scarcity, right? What's the point? Again, if they can get this elsewhere, if they can get it later, then they probably will. So why should they care about this scarce resource that you're going to give them if they sign up for your email list, right? What's the point? And then it's got to be convenient. So how do they get it? And if it's too hard, people will probably just overlook it or they'll forget. And when it comes the time that they can actually do it, they're not going to do it. Because think about when people are listening to your podcast. Again, in the car, in the shower, walking, working out, a lot of times they're not ready to take action right that moment. Now, you want to try with your urgency to get them to, but if they're not ready, you want to make it convenient so they can remember what it is, right? So an example of a compelling offer is that when we're trying to get people onto our email list for the assembly call, I let them know, hey, there are almost 1,700 people on our list for the assembly call, and the reason why so many people have signed up is that we deliver post-game emails the morning after every game at 6:30 Central Time. It includes my analysis, Andy's analysis, Will's stat of the game, and we don't put this content out anywhere else. It's not on the blog. It's only for subscribers. So make sure that you get tomorrow morning's email by signing up tonight. Go to assemblycall.com/subscribe or text Indiana to 44144 and get on the list. And that offer right there has driven so many signups because it's urgent, right? Get on the list before tomorrow morning's email comes out. It's scarce. You can only get it via email. We don't put it on our blog, and it's convenient. An easy URL, assemblycall.com/subscribe, and we've even started doing text messaging because, again, think of your audience. A lot of times they're on their phone when they're listening. Text Indiana to 44144. Urgent, scarce, convenient. If you combine that with a compelling incentive, you will drive tons of signups to your email list. And then step number 3 is pretty simple. Again, hard to do, simple to explain, which is just communicate that offer consistently. So what I just told you, that call to action for the assembly call, I have now done it 60 sometimes this season. Indiana's played like 26 games. I do it 2, sometimes 3 times per hour-long show. I've never once had a complaint from people like, man, you're doing that call to action again, it's too much. Now, I, in my own head, have felt like, man, I can't believe I'm going to do this again. I'm getting tired of saying it. But something very important to remember, and Johnny Nasser, my co-host on the Showrunner, always reminds me of this, is that when you get sick of saying it, is about the time that your audience first starts paying attention to it, right? And it's especially important on a podcast where we're trying to connect via audio. You may have to say it 6, 7, 8 times for people just to remember what the offer is, to remember what the URL is, to get it. So don't, and once people are signed up, they realize that to build your email list, you have to let people know. So people aren't just going to say, well, screw this, he's doing that call to action again, so I'm not going to keep listening or I'm going to unsubscribe. And if they do, it's probably okay. That probably isn't really your person anyway, so that's all right. But communicating it consistently is so important. So in every episode, maybe a couple times an episode, let people know what they need to do and why they need to do it. That's so, so important. Because if you have the compelling incentive and the compelling offer, it may not get the attention it deserves, which means your email list may not get the subscribers that it deserves if you're not communicating it consistently. So don't overlook the importance of that. And then finally, step number 4 is deliver on or exceed your promises. So if I tell people who are listening to the assembly call that you're getting this email at 6:30 Central Time the next morning, that email better be there. And it better not just be a link to our post-game show. It better have my thoughts in it, and it better have Andy's analysis, and it better have Will's stat of the game, because that's what I said is going to be in there. And then, you know what, every now and then, or maybe more than every now and then, exceed those promises. So send a midweek email that gives people a little bit extra. Go the extra mile in your regular email to add even more content to it, to add more insight to it, right? Deliver on those promises and exceed them. Because if you fall short of your promises, now that trust that we talked about trying to build, both on a podcast and in an email, is going to start to erode. Because a relationship with an audience member is just like a relationship with a human being in real life. Every time an expectation is set and isn't met, a little bit of trust erodes. But every time an expectation is set and met or exceeded, trust builds. And we want to constantly be making deposits into that kind of trust bank that we have, right? So you've got to deliver on or exceed your promises, and then finally transform your audience. So get people onto an email list, but then take them somewhere and know where you're taking them. So it can't just be for a podcast, just updates about your show. Because most people, when they're getting updates about a podcast, they're subscribed in some type of podcast player, and they're going to go to that player and see if you have a new show. You know, we very rarely on the showrunner were people actually clicking on the links to go to our episodes when we would send them episode update emails. You want to give them something else, take them someplace. Once we added our autoresponder, the 4 essential elements of a remarkable podcast, to that email list, now over the first week that people are on that list, we take them somewhere. From just kind of hearing a few ideas on the showrunner to now understanding the 4 pillars of our course and the pillars of how we believe podcasts should be run. That took them somewhere. For the assembly call, we take people from disengaged IU fans alone in their living room with their own thoughts to being part of a community where fans just like them who really devote time to the team can educate them with our insight, give them a different view on the game, and also help them feel connected. It transforms their experience of being an IU fan through the season. And if you don't know what type of transformation you want people to make with your show and with your email list, I think you really want to step back, understand it. And this goes back to our authenticity. What are your audience's dreams and goals and fears and just everyday issues that you can help them with? You want that. You want to be part of that transformation. Your podcast certainly should help you do that, and your email list can help take it to the next level. And that is everything I got. I think we did okay on time, didn't we, Brent?
It feels good.
Okay, good.
I was still listening and taking notes.
Yes, so yeah, and if we have questions, I'd love, because I know that there's a lot of specifics about both podcasting and building an email list that, you know, for a general presentation we can't really get into, but I'd be happy to take those now.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got quite a few questions that have come in, and I have a couple of my own as well. So let me start with everybody else's, and we'll see if we get time to get to mine. So first question we have is, how can you drive email signups in a genuine way that doesn't seem salesy? And, you know, this is something that was a question of mine as well. I mean, a lot of times we see this in marketing as a whole. It's like, you know, you tell somebody, hey, you need to go and do this to have success, and then they just run and do it full steam, you know, and don't really think about the impact that it will have on people's perspective of them. So how do you approach it? Well, you know, to try to get what you want in that regard without being salesy and not being too far.
To me, the most important thing is enthusiasm, right? And it's not just energy, because I think you can have energy and speak loudly and speak confidently, but it can come across as salesy. But the one thing that you cannot hide on a podcast is your genuine enthusiasm. And it's literally scientifically proven that there are elements of our voice that other people can pick up on to know if we really believe what we're saying, if we're really enthusiastic and genuine with what we're saying. And so I think if you're really enthusiastic about your topic, about what your offer is, and about why your audience should take part in it, that is going to come across. And I think that will, you know, even if you have a strong call to action, like I think our call to action for Assembly Call, if you just wrote it out on a piece of paper, it would probably sound pretty salesy, even though, you know, we're not trying to, no one has to pay any money, it's all free. But I think the reason why people connect with it is they see that there's a genuine enthusiasm, you know.
And is it, I mean, so you have the quality podcast and stuff, but like, I mean, I guess there's a difference in saying like I'm trying to, get people to do something through my voice and talking on the thing, and then versus the, opt-in monster style pop-up, right? Where it's like,
Yeah.
hey, sign up for this newsletter and get something, through our newsletter. Do you have an example maybe of how that works on one of your sites? Do you have
Sure.
something like that you can give an example of?
Yeah, I mean, and actually, and I probably should have talked about this in the presentation. If you go to assemblycall.com and scroll down, you'll probably be hit with a pop-up from AppSumo. And when we put that on there, we started it last season in November. Our email list was at about 100. Once we put that on there, we got up to 800, 900 by the end of the season. And I was really worried that having the pop-up on there would drive the subscriber numbers, but that we'd have a huge churn rate. And what I ended up finding is that we actually had a 97% retention rate on our email subscribers. And again, I think part of the reason why is we tell people exactly what they're going to get from the email list, and that's exactly what they get. So when they sign up, even if they're a little bit hesitant, then they get a nice welcome email, and those emails come after every game. We're not doing anything extra with the list other than surprising them, not doing anything like slipping in these different sales messages, that kind of thing. Like they're getting what we say they're going to get, and I think when there's a match of expectations, then you can have a pop-up and do those kind of things.
So on that point, it's kind of like saying like to kind of emphasize on that element of that. It's like, look, you're giving them what you say you're going to give them, right? So one of the things that people might try to do is they might try to say, hey, sign up and get A, B, and C, which is interesting, right? You might get some insight into these games and stuff. But if there's an underlying business model that requires a conversion, is it okay to provide something of value but yet still slip in the sales call? I mean, would you just say that you just need to make it really sound like it's more of a value add than it is an actual sales call?
Yeah, and we're getting ready to do that for Digital Commerce Institute. So Digital Commerce Academy so far has been it's a completely paid program, but we're getting ready to launch a free program. There's a podcast, there's going to be blog posts, we're going to give people free taste to Digital Commerce Academy where they can see some webinars that are only for paid members. They can see part of a course. And so that will all be laid out there on the sales page, and then we will have sprinkled in, based on if they take some action, some automated sales messages that basically say, hey, you've gotten to have you've gotten to see what Digital Commerce Academy is all about. If you want the full version, you can get it for X. And so, and again, it's all the biggest point here, I think, is you've got to give people a lot of value. And you got to give people a lot of free value with your email list, probably more than you think. But if you look at it and you're wondering, you're hesitant to ask them for the email address because you think there's not enough free value here to really delight them. I'm going to be sending them too many sales messages. Then you probably are, and you probably need to back off. That's one thing that's always helped me is I've never questioned the value that I'm giving because it's been so overwhelming. And I think when you do that, then people will respond to it.
So looking at email platforms, what is your favorite? What are in the same field as your favorite for potential platforms for people to gather and send the actual emails through?
It's a good question. So we're actually, my current and future favorite is going to be the Rainmaker platform because we actually have email built into that now where people who get on the platform, they will actually have up to 1,000 email addresses included just as part of the platform, and there's an autoresponder feature and you can send broadcasts. So, to me, when you can then combine that with marketing automation and everything else, that's going to be huge. I've heard a lot of good things about ConvertKit. I haven't used ConvertKit myself, but I know that for people who are doing content marketing, that can be very helpful. I myself use MailChimp for both the assembly call and for Primility, and have really liked it, just the simplicity of it. Have also used Aweber and had success there. So part of it is I think, and some lists are better for certain things than others. So really part of it is kind of getting in and seeing which one is going to fit right for you, because maybe you really want to do autoresponders and email courses, and one may be better for than another for that. But those have been the main ones that I have experience with.
And the one that I personally have used that I've kind of liked has been MailChimp. What I have really liked about MailChimp is I think they're in that right pocket for customer service. So when you
Yeah.
have, I found that like, hey, I threw all these emails in there, maybe I probably shouldn't have, they seem like they'd fit. They go, well, you shouldn't do that, but they don't like shut your account down, right? It's like they've been
Yeah.
really open to kind of working with you and kind of being more transparent and helping you, do the right thing over time. The one thing I have noticed with MailChimp is I had this big debate between MailChimp and Constant Contact over events. Seems like events is a really tough point because certain places they kind of build core off of being able to do like individual events, and other people don't. MailChimp's one that doesn't focus, really on events, which is
Yeah.
I'm hoping that changes over time.
Yeah, and the other thing to watch out for with MailChimp too is if you want to split your list into other lists, like I'll have my main list, but then, for people who really engage, I want to create a separate list, or for people who are part of the free membership as opposed to the free list. Like let's say that I have 1,700 on the free list and then there's 600 on the free membership, but there's a lot of overlap. They count each of those as a separate, so that counts as 2,300 subscribers instead of just the total number of email addresses, and you have to pay. So based on how you're going to set it up, that may you may want to look at that too. So again, there's some
something that in the platform that you guys are doing, is that something it's going to count just purely by email, not by how many
just
people
one.
which lists?
Yeah, because that's it, if you're doing marketing automation, it's so important to be able to tag and to be able to send messages based on what people do and put them on different lists, but you don't want to be paying extra every time you do that. So I think that's going to start becoming a standard feature of most platforms.
And is that a tagging feature, or is that like a building list feature? Is there really a difference between that? Because I mean, in my head, I'm thinking, wow, if I could tag, people as with certain identifiers versus making a bunch of lists on identifiers, is there a real difference
there?
there?
Is much better. It's much more convenient to be able to tag as opposed to creating individual lists for all of them. So yeah, if you can do tagging, that's a much better way to go.
What frequency is optimal for doing podcast episodes? I mean, obviously you want to hit the ground running, but I mean, one a week, one every other week, one a month to start with. What makes sense?
That's a great question. I think the standard rule of thumb is once a week. I think you really want to get in there once a week so that people don't forget about you, so that you stay top of mind. Even if people aren't going to listen to your show, there's just something about seeing you there in the feed. They see your headline. Maybe they want to pass this week, but at least you were there. It's not you were here and then you show up 6 weeks later with another one, and now instead of thinking, do I want to listen to this, they're thinking, wait a minute, what show is this again? Why am I subscribed to this? So, and it can depend. I mean, there are daily shows that work. You look at Hardcore History with Dan Carlin, and those are 4-hour-long episodes where he puts one out maybe once every couple of months, and that's okay because they're so substantial and people are used to that schedule. But most of us aren't Dan Carlin, and most of us don't have the time, inclination, or ability to do a daily show. So I think for most people, once a week is a good rule of thumb, and I would really try my best not to go less frequent than that if I could.
Yeah, that seems to make sense. I thought at one point maybe once every 2 weeks or so, but that makes sense to be visible, on a regular basis. So I have a couple more questions. I'm going to take a quick break. I just want to emphasize again, we have a survey coming if we've, that we'd like everybody to fill out in a couple minutes. If we've missed anything, please make sure to ask questions in Twitter. Also want to mention our next webinar really quickly. We're going to do one, it's going to be on March 2nd. And it's going to be about visual marketing in 2016 and why you still need it and why it's more important. And I think that's going to be pretty cool. I'm a little biased. Nemanja is my creative director, so he's from my design firm, so I'm a little biased on that. But one of the things I was harping at him about the other day was the fact that we constantly watch all these studies where they're like 80%, digestion of content when it's visual, all these stats, and then people go, oh, I'm going to get into visual content. Let me throw my stock image on an article, and that's my visual content. Yeah. So I kind of it took me a lot of pulling, his, pushing him and nagging him, but I got him to do a presentation on that. So, but anyway,
and Brent, can I add one thing to that last question that you asked? Because there are people who, when they hear once a week, that does sound intimidating, and it may even not be feasible for their schedule. One thing to remember is that the value of creating a podcast isn't just in getting a whole bunch of subscribers to that podcast. It can be the actual act of creating the content. So let's say that you can't do it once a week, but you can do an episode once a month, and you can put it out there. Maybe you can do that for 10 episodes. If you sit down and game plan that smartly, okay, you may not get a whole bunch of subscribers to your podcast, but you've now created 10 audio episodes that you could then package up and make your incentive for people to get on your email list. And so it doesn't always have an ongoing podcast. You can create a series that ends up being a standalone series that is then a really good incentive for people to get on there. And if you're smart about your titling, that can stay out there in iTunes, and if people are searching for something on that title, they'll find you, and even if it's just those 10 episodes. So there's a couple different ways to use podcasts. One for kind of the ongoing, get that subscription, keep putting something out every week. But even if you can't do that, that doesn't mean that there aren't still great benefits to putting a podcast out there.
And can you, I mean, I guess you would say as well is that if the reality is you can only do one a month and that's it, then by all means do one a month and participate the best you can. One of my questions was going to be, a lot of thought goes into like, I want to talk about these topics, I want to plan. I always think to myself whenever I'm thinking about podcasts is maybe I don't have as much to say, but who do I know that does? And how can I bring a guest on that is essentially going to allow me to have a topic of interest without having to put a lot of the brain work into it, and not to sound shortcutting or not to sound lazy about it. It's just sometimes you need that to fill in, and so I've always done that. I've always thought that that's a great way, and I think a lot of people don't understand like the perspective that people have is that nobody really dissects it that much. One of the things we always laughed about was if you put an infographic, you could take somebody else's infographic, publish it on your site, and you can say, this company made this awesome infographic, it's beautiful, it's great, and people will still in the comments say, you guys made a great infographic. Well, we didn't make it. People don't pay attention to that, right? So when you have guests on and they're providing good value, is your opinion, similar to mine in that still is perceived as your value?
Absolutely. I was actually at a lawyer conference a couple of weeks ago, and a guy by the name of John Skiba, who runs a popular, show for lawyers where he interviews people. He said he doesn't even really care about how many people actually listen to his podcast. He actually does it because it gives him an excuse to reach out to people in his industry who he wants to talk to and make contacts with. And on the flip side, it does. It works great. And then if you look at Hack the Entrepreneur, John Nasser's show, he knew in September of 2014 that he wanted to do a show about entrepreneurship. Okay, so he decided to do an interview show. Most of his questions, he uses the same questions each show for the people that he interviews, but he went out and found out entrepreneurs, knew that he wanted to talk about the tactics of entrepreneurs, and he lets them be the star. Now, he's built an email list and has built a lot of authority and has a book now because of it, but it's the people that are providing their stories and their insight, and he's more the curator of it, which is another great way to go.
And it works. I mean, I don't know how many connections I've made, Jay Bear, like just across the board where I've just simply said, hey, would you like to join a podcast? We get into that conversation. You get into the emails back and forth setting it up. Before you know it, you're connected on LinkedIn. You're connected in different places. And you've almost made a friend or a colleague out of these individuals. And I've actually looked, I've been reading news and said, ooh, that's a really interesting story. One of them was Ilya Grigorik, who's one of the developers at Google and who's behind PageSpeed and all this other stuff. Watched one of his videos and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Just emailed him, said, would you join my podcast and talk about this more? And was able to create a connection out of it. So that's another way of being able to get, some of these, if you're scheduling out your podcast, you can kind of use that for a multitude of benefits as well as making sure you can do one a week.
Yep.
Jumping back into some more, maybe a dumb question. I don't think there's any dumb questions, but should you only do podcasts about topics you're passionate about? You mentioned that earlier, passion's key. Can you steer away from that, or should that really be a cornerstone kind of, element to creating topics?
This is always an interesting question because it ends up boiling down to what individual people's definition of passion comes to. Like I remember having a real problem with Cal Newport's book where he talked about, how passion doesn't matter, because it felt like what he would talk about as not being passion was still kind of passion. I mean, look, you don't have to, just because I'm passionate about basketball doesn't mean that's the only show that I could do. I was not particularly passionate about digital entrepreneurship when we started doing Digital Commerce Academy, and now I've started a show called The Digital Entrepreneur with Brian Clark. But what I am passionate about is doing my job to the best of my ability, helping build, our assets at Rainmaker Digital, and I'm passionate about creating a good show and working with Brian Clark. So there are all these things I am passionate about, to where if I allow that to drive my content creation, now I become passionate about the topic. So
Yeah.
I think you've got to have some kind of, if it's not passion, you've got to have enthusiasm for what you're doing. And if you don't have enthusiasm for it, then it's probably not worth doing. And so it can be a bit semantic, but I think something like that has to be there, because I just don't think it'll come across, and you won't stick with it. A lot of shows end up fading after 7 to 10 episodes, or again after 20 to 25 episodes. And that's when you really start building the connection with the audience if you're going to do an ongoing show. And so if you're going to put in that time to get there, you really, I think, want to have that enthusiasm that will help you overcome that dip once it happens.
And I think that most angles, which are, I did one on predictive analytics. Analytics is probably one of my hardest topics, but we took that and took it outside of just marketing and took it to like social and politics and things that were actually interesting about social engineering through data and stuff like that. And I think there's always an angle you can take any discussion to find your passion in it, to find an angle that's passionate, in there. Optimal length. Everybody wants to know. Everybody wants to know, should it be 5 minutes and make my life easy, or does it need to be 30 or an hour? What's the optimal length for a podcast?
That's a great question, and there's no perfect answer, but the general rule of thumb, and there's some data to back it up, seems to be that 18 to 22 minutes is the sweet spot. Now, I will offer that with a caveat, because if you're doing an interview show, I don't think that's enough. And if you look at a lot of really successful interview shows, they are in the 30 to 40-minute range. And if you're really good like Tim Ferriss, then you can do 3-hour-long interviews. Now, most people probably don't want to do that, but I think it's going to depend on your format. So an interview show should be a little bit longer, because you need a little bit more time to delve into some of the good stuff. If it's going to be a monologue show, you may want to keep it to 8 to 12 minutes, because it's just you, and it can be very hard for an individual person to maintain people's attention unless there's a lot of production value and that kind of thing. Yeah. So I think, like we recorded an episode of The Showrunner yesterday, and we were like, okay, we usually go 35, 40 minutes. Let's stick with the sweet spot. Let's get it between 18 to 22 minutes. And even our editor said, he's like, hey, I like this length. This actually, this sounded good. So I think that's a good rule of thumb for most people. And it's one of those, that's what you should shoot for. And if you're going to go outside of that, just make sure you have a real reason why you're going to do it. Like, you don't want to do a 26-minute show just because you rambled. You want to do a 26-minute show because it was a discussion and you needed that amount of time to get the good stuff out of the person. So, but 18 to 22 minutes is a pretty good sweet spot.
One more question. I got time for one more. People who are starting out, they're interested in doing this. Can you run through the elevator pitch for putting together software, mics? How do you choose the right spot to record? Like, just really kind of walk through the bare bones of what people should look at for a starting point.
The first thing I would say is, do not, under any circumstances, let yourself get stuck worrying about that. All right? I mean, I think there are some definite things that you want to consider, but people that we've worked with inside the Showrunner course and listeners to the Showrunner, they get stuck and don't start and lose their enthusiasm and get frustrated for technical reasons more than any other. And it's your content that matters more than the tech stuff. So you see now, I've got this, you can't really see my face because I've got this boom arm and this real nice PR40 mic. I have earned this by doing like 800 podcast episodes. And for a while, I didn't have anything even close to this nice. But I was still able to get a minimum level of quality just with a USB mic plugged into my computer. And you can get a Yeti, you can get one of the AR mics for 60 to 100 bucks. It plugs in via USB, and that will help you get the minimum level of quality that you need. And you can use free software like Audacity and GarageBand to edit it. And if you're going to do interviews, you can use Skype, and you can invest whatever it is, 25 bucks in call recorder to do interviews. But I think if you're going beyond that without ever having recorded an episode or launched a podcast before, you're doing too much. Focus on your content, get the minimum level of audio quality, and then allow your show to grow as your experience grows, as your audience grows, it's okay if it's not perfect right off the bat. So just, you know, you don't want to tell anybody don't do something as high quality as you could, but the problem is we really see people who get hung up here when they really just need to be go recording and putting stuff out there. And with the $60 to $100 mics, you can get something good enough. And then there's plenty of free tools out there for the editing and for everything else that you need to do. Focus on your content, focus on your audience more, and the rest of it will come.
Beautiful. Sounds beautiful. So like I said, that was the last question we had. I do want to invite everybody, please continue sending questions through. We will make sure they get to Jerod. We'll make sure we get answers for you. If Jerod has time to stick around and track Twitter a little bit, we'll continue to discuss anything there with the hashtag #SEJThinkTank. Again, if you have a couple minutes for the survey, we're going to send out pop-up. It would be great. And don't forget to mark your calendars for visual marketing in 2016 and why you still need it, March 2nd. Jerod, always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for joining us and for doing this presentation. A lot of really good information in there. And we'll make sure all the links get up there so that everybody can get over and get those guides.
Yeah, no, thank you. This was a pleasure. I love talking about this. So yeah, tweet me. If you guys send over any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.